Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place where we share creative and inspiring learning in our schools. Episode 68. Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast with me, Mark Taylor. Today I'm joined by Jen Lumanlan, and she's from the Your Parenting Mojo podcast. And I've been involved with Jen in various ways through the podcasting world, but more recently she's created a course about supporting your child and learning in school, and she very kindly asked myself and Peter Cancel to be on that and to be interviewed, and we had a great conversation about that. So I thought we'd bring Jen on and she can talk a little bit about our podcast and all the great value that she can offer from that perspective, and also some of the course and all the learnings that she's done through there. So Jen, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
So can we start with a little bit of background about you and how you got into your podcast? And I know it's very research based, so how your sort of your research and that kind of thing has also impacted on that.
Yeah, and I should clarify right up front, because your English listeners are going to be curious about my accent, that I am English originally. Although I've been in the States for about 20 years now, and I understand that it has rubbed off a little bit, although I still sound English in my head. So I've been here for a long time. Had a great life in California, never thought I'd have a baby. Got pregnant by choice, actually, and not by accident. Was really never interested in being a parent, but here I am with an almost 4-year-old. And after I guess after my daughter probably turned about 1, I'd read all the books about raising an infant and what you have to do to manage sleep and eating and all that stuff. And then she turned 1, 18 months-ish, and I realized that all of the tools I'd been using thus far weren't working anymore, and I needed a whole different toolkit, and I had no idea where to start. And at the same time, I was seeing a lot of psychological research, and it's all very presented in a very clickbait way. If you just look at it online, it's, look at what's this latest study saying, and I'm thinking, well, how do I know how this fits in the body of research that has already been done on this? Is this completely in opposition to that, or does it confirm what came before? And so I thought, well, clearly, I have no parenting intuition whatsoever, but I have really good research skills. And so I decided to use the latter to close the gap on the former. And I actually ended up going back to school and getting a master's in psychology, basically so I could be a better parent. And then got really interested in education after that, and ended up getting another master's in education because I really do love to learn. And I started the podcast because it just kind of seemed silly that I was doing all this learning and not sharing it with anybody. And so it seems as though I've really struck a chord in some way, because I think there's a real hunger out there for this information, for somebody who will take a look at the science and try and understand what the science says, but also not be a slave to the science. Make sure to look at the issues that science has related to bringing in bias and sampling bias and all kinds of assumptions about the population that you're working with, and making sure to probe those as well, so that people can really understand, how is this relevant to me, and how do I want to use this information to make decisions about parenting.
Fantastic. And what I really love is the way so many of us in the podcasting world, the podcast comes out of our love for what we're doing, or our interest for what we're doing, and so it's the first time I've heard people just going back to school to get master's degrees in anything they're interested in. So I'm thinking I'm quite like cooking. Maybe I should be going to culinary school or something just to start all those sorts of things.
You could.
Yeah,
I'm sure your family would appreciate it.
I'm sure they would as well. So. From that sort of learning point of view and that study point of view, I mean, I guess the biggest thing that you bring to your audience is the fact that most people don't have the time to do that, and because you're sort of geared into that way of researching and learning already, that's a real asset to be able to share with everybody.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm just as time strapped as everybody else. I don't I'm not superhuman, but it's in my brain. My brain is wired for this. I love to learn, and it's just something that I find enjoyable. My husband's crashed in front of the TV on the couch, and I'm writing podcast episodes. So I like to multitask. I like to be busy. I like to bring new information to light. So yeah, I love doing it.
How exactly did the courses come about? You sort of said you had the research and you realised that people were interested, and you could basically sort of put all those things together and sort of join all the dots together. So why was it that you felt that creating a course for some of these things was actually going to be beneficial for people?
Yeah, and it's funny actually. Each one came out of a master's thesis, so you're basically getting that research when you go through the course. So my first master's was in psychology, focused on child development, and my thesis was actually on what motivates children to learn. And so I really wanted to dig deep and understand, how do children learn? What is the process that they go through? And so the second one sort of followed on from that in the master's in education, because I basically built the entire course for my education thesis. So what I learned was that children, and all people really, learn best when they're learning about something that interests them. So if you think about how you learn and the last training that you took that was mandated for your job, do you remember much about it? Because I can tell you, I don't remember much about the last one that I had to take. And then think about something you need to learn for yourself. And for me, that was a YouTube video on how to paint watercolor skies. I'm really getting interested in watercolors right now as well in my spare time. And I do remember that content, and I can put it to practice. So it's really, I trace this process of curiosity about something through interest, through learning some very basic skills, which sort of sets up a low-level understanding that gives you enough information to be able to do some more learning. And that helps you to develop confidence. And then eventually you keep sort of going through this loopy process, and you get to a place that's called flow, where you're sort of really deep into the learning process, and you're getting feedback on what you're doing well. And it's inherent feedback. It's not somebody saying you're doing a good job. It's you're seeing the limitations in what you know, and you're going and filling those limitations and exploring them. And that's what we want learning to be like. And so I found research that said all toddlers are curious, every single one of them. They all want to know, why, mama, what is this? But by third grade, they just stop asking questions, because what they have learned is it's the teacher's questions that are important. And the only questions they ask by third grade are, is this going to be on the test?
Wow.
And some aspect of clarification about how to do something that they've been told to do. And so to me, that just kind of blew my mind. And so I looked around at different models of schools, and I discovered Sudbury Schools, which is a model based on Summerhill in the UK, or Sudbury Valley School in the US. And it's very child-led, and the children basically get to do whatever they want, which sounds kind of crazy, but it ends up establishing a lifelong love of learning. And there just isn't a facility like that close enough to me to make it workable. So I realized that homeschooling was going to be basically the only way that I could make this work. And so I spent a year researching that decision as sort of a follow-on from the master's thesis. Do I need to know everything my child needs to know before I start? Is it even legal where I am? How do they get socialized? Can they even get into college? All of those kinds of things. And so every time I would mention homeschooling my daughter to somebody, they would ask me the same questions.
Right.
Basically the same questions that I just asked you. And so I realized, if everybody's asking the same questions, this is the kind of thing that can be turned into a course. So that my first course is on how to make the decision to figure out if homeschooling is right for you.
And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because it is that I always think it sounds idyllic, the fact homeschooling and the fact you have complete control and you've got time freedom in lots of ways, and just your whole life is part of a natural learning process within whatever form you want to do that in relation to how your life is actually working. But then there are the real practicalities of how do we actually do that? How does the cost implication come in? Are there other people doing it? Is my child going to be isolated? I imagine those are the sorts of things that people get to ask you.
Yeah, for sure. And that's all sort of encompassed in that course. But what I realized when I talked to people about it was, some people would say, homeschooling sounds amazing. I would love to do it, but I just can't. For whatever reason it is. It might be a financial reason. They have two parents working and one of them just cannot stop, or they can't reimagine their career in a different way that could enable homeschooling. Or some parents are just really committed to public schools for whatever reason it may be. And so what I ended up doing was, as I was going through this master's in education, where I was really wanting to fully understand the education system, was thinking, okay, I can use this to support parents who are sort of interested in the model of interest-led learning, of child-led learning, and use that to support parents who are committed to public schools. And so some of the things I cover in that course are, there's a lot of information on the research of the benefits of parental participation in education, which, coming from a psychology background, it's really common to see research that says, yeah, this is correlated with that. And then you see other research that says, no, there's no correlation there. And so you end up trying to find some kind of middle ground. So it's kind of stunning, the research on parental participation in education, that it basically across the board says it is valuable. Parental participation in education is valuable, but there are so many potential forms of participation and which one is best. So we really dig into those deeply. And a lot of it actually depends on the power structure in the school, because it might seem to parents as though teachers have a lot of power, but actually a lot of the power lies further up the food chain than that.
Yes, yeah.
So the people who create the curriculum and the standardized tests actually end up wielding most of the power, and the parents are sort of off to the side. And I think there's a lot of unease among teachers who, this kind of blew my mind, teachers are never trained to interact with parents. They're winging it.
Yeah, I can see that actually. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And so I think parents really have this deep expertise in their own children. You are the expert in your children more than anyone else will ever be. And schools just don't really understand how to put that information to good use. So we cover how to bring your participation and in a really productive way into the school environment.
And on that topic, have you found that to be the best case? Because I've often found that sometimes teachers feel like you're either stepping on their toes, or you don't really know what you're talking about, or maybe you're suggesting they're doing it wrong, or they could be doing it better. So how do you get that sort of real participation in sort of community cohesion feel?
Yeah, it really depends so much on the individual parent, the individual teacher, the individual child, the individual school. Sure. So it's sort of difficult to give blanket advice, which is why in the course we have a Facebook group actually that's linked, and people can go and post questions about this, and the community can respond in have you tried this, have you tried that, think about these angles as you're initiating a conversation with the teacher. And so it's really based on the parent's style, the teacher's style, and some teachers prefer to be contacted via email. Other teachers can't stand being contacted by email and want you to show up at school. So it's understanding your unique situation and how best to approach it based on whatever issue it is that you're having that you need to solve.
So, I mean, I have to say, in my personal experience, the one thing that I've realised in recent times, and I have mentioned this briefly on some of the other podcasts, our eldest child has been in hospital for quite a long time, and it's been quite a traumatic time for us as a family, but in lots of ways a very enlightening time, because what it's given us is it's given us an insight, or an insightfulness, I should say, really, of what is it that we need to happen today. There is nothing more important than your needs at this particular moment, from being, do you need to go to school today, or is it better to stay at home? Or if you are going to be in school, what type of day is that going to look like? And I have to say, our two younger children, the schools that they've been at have been absolutely fantastic. That particular kind of sense of, we know you need support, we've got something in place that can help you, we can chat to you, all that kind of stuff has been absolutely brilliant. But what I'm really interested in is the fact that I don't want people to be in crisis mode before you actually get that kind of individual attention, because actually there's another child, sat on the next table who probably needs that as well, because they don't want to be sat in class for 6 hours. They actually want to be outside, or whatever that individual kind of need is. And actually, if we could find a way of doing that for everybody all of the time, I think there's a much nicer way of learning in that particular scenario within the school system.
I agree. That sounds lovely. And I'm not sure how much you've shared with your audience about your particular crisis situation, but yes, you are right that I think the school district is rallying around you because of this particular crisis that your family has been going through. And I think it's important to recognize that there are plenty of other crises that aren't recognized as crises by the school district. And so I'm actually reading a book right now on it's about a school in the Houston school district in Texas, and the low academic achievement among Mexican American students, because they just don't feel as though they belong. They don't feel as though the teachers care about them, that the school system cares about them, that they're going to be able to go to college at the end, that doing anything in school really has any benefit for their lives. And I would say that is a crisis situation too, but it's not recognized as such by the school district. And so I hate to say that you're fortunate in this situation, because I think it's not really a great way of thinking about it. But in some ways you are, because you are the beneficiary of this system coming to rally around you. And there are many other people and children in the system who are nowhere near as lucky.
Absolutely, and I think the other thing that it's made me realise is the fact that it's amazing how much power you feel you have when it deems to be that important, and I think if parents actually felt like, actually, it's not just another day, my child really needs this or my child really needs that, and I'm going to go to the school and really ask it, I wonder whether actually they'd be surprised, because I think a lot of the time when you're really concise and you really, as you said, you understand your child better than anybody, and you can really articulate what it is they need and why they need it, often you get quite a good response back, because at the end of the day, schools are trying to get the best out of the children for the children's sake and also for their own sake in this sort of day and age of funding and numbers and all of that kind of thing. So I think as long as you're concise and you really understand what it is that you're asking for with real purpose and real good reason, I think it can become a little bit more personalised in that scenario, because, of course, generally these policies are made as a whole, and of course that's always been the problem. It's there to sort of govern everybody, and it's certainly one of the things that the head teacher of Katie, our youngest, I've had before, has been the fact that I completely understand what you're saying, Mr. Taylor, but you're the only person I've ever met that we're having this type of conversation. Generally speaking, they don't care, or no one's ever thought of it like that before, which I also understand as well. But the point is that it's your life as a parent, it's your child's life as they're growing up through school. So don't wait for there to be a crisis when you ask these questions. Actually go and do it, and actually see what feedback you get back then. And I think if you can do that, if you can find a way of doing that, I think it really, really will help.
Yeah.
And certainly following on from that, one of the things I've touched on before is certainly the idea of the story of the child, both in terms of their family life and all that kind of thing, but the sorts of things that they're really interested in. And as you said at the beginning, how have you experienced that idea of creating the learning environment around things that they're interested in when you've got this sort of curriculum which is based for everybody? And how does that become a bit more personalised, or do you think it can be?
Yeah, it can. I just want to go back a minute to something you said about the fact that you can take a concern to the school and express it and try and get them to address it. I agree. I think you can. But I just want to acknowledge that you have a certain amount of power in the schools just by benefit of who you are. You're known as an interactive parent who will bring concerns to the school. You've had regular conversations with the head teachers at your children's school. You're a member of his policy group on primary education. Yeah. You have a lot of power. You have more power than many other parents do. And if we think about a parent from a different demographic background, for example, a lower socioeconomic status or a different ethnic background, we might see that they may not have the choice to say, what's best for my child today? Can I keep my child off school? Chances are Child Protective Services, or the equivalent in the UK, is not going to come after your family, but that's not the case for every family.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And
so as the two different parents doing something that is very similar in the best interest of their child can get very different responses from the bureaucratic system. So I just want to acknowledge that and just say, yes, your job is to advocate for your child, but it can be a much more difficult thing to do for some parents than for others.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I completely understand that.
But going forward I think what you're basically asking is, how do I make sure that my child retains a lifelong love of learning when they're being taught using a standardized curriculum and have to pass standardized tests.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And so that sort of gets to the heart of what the second course was about, is supporting your child's learning in school. So yes, that's about understanding the power systems, but it's also about a real balancing act. And how do you walk this tightrope of supporting your child of doing well in school, which basically means doing well on standardized tests, which means memorizing a lot of information of questionable use, and because somebody tells you to do it. and on the other side of that, you're trying to help the child maintain some kind of intrinsic motivation to learn what's interesting to them, and you want them to learn how to learn rather than just have someone say read page 42 through 57 and write a summary. And so we spend a lot of time in the course on this. And of course, all this is easier when you're homeschooling because you don't have to balance. You don't have to do the standardized testing. So I think the pieces of potentially reforming schools to make this easier are there, but it hasn't happened because there's too much power invested in the current system. So what I aim to do is to have parents bring out as much as they can of what school reform might look like if it were to happen, and just kind of do that for themselves. So we know that children become really deeply invested in learning when it's relevant to their interests and needs, and particularly when it's what's known as place-based learning, when it's something that's relevant to their life, to their local park or places where they spend time. And we know they struggle to learn when somebody else determines what they have to learn. And that when you provide extrinsic motivators to learn, like grades, like standardized tests, that it decreases children's willingness to learn for the sake of learning. So how do you balance those things? Well, a lot of it is figuring out, how do I support my child in learning what they're interested in learning outside of school? So if my child has a particular passion, how do I nurture that so that they really become a deep expert in that topic, if that's what they want to do, and they feel confident and comfortable sharing that knowledge with other people who are also probably experts in it, and really maintaining this intrinsic motivation to learn so they know how to do it, even though they also have to do this rote memorization for school.
And I think that's the real key at the moment, and I think a little bit that's helped me in recent times with this is the fact that if you can put yourself just one step removed and realise that school is just an invaluable tool for learning, it's, yes, you have to go and yes, you have to do it, but it's only a tool. It's a great way to learn to read and write. It's a great way to build up social understanding, plus all the really great things that you do learn within school, but it's only one facet of your ability to learn. And like you say, if your interest happens to be something where you can find out a lot of information on YouTube, or there's a community group where you can learn, outside of school, then actually from there you can keep that passion going and see that the things that you're learning in school can support that in some way. I think the hard thing for lots of people is the fact that you're in school for a lot of your life, a lot of hours of each day, which is really hard. And also you're being told the same thing over and over again by people that you respect and people that you have to obey in lots of ways. That's the whole way the school system's actually put in, and that those are two really key things. So it's really difficult to do, but I think supporting children to understand that it is what it is, but actually if we can guide you, like you said, and that's the real parenting job, I think, I can support you in this area because I know you like this. This is important and we'll do it as the best we can, but let's not lose too much sleep over the fact that maybe that particular quadratic equation that you need to now learn at the age of 7 isn't necessarily going to make that much difference, or however that happens to be. And I think that's a really key perspective, but like you say, that's easier said than done in lots of scenarios.
Yeah. And I remember when we talked the last time, when I interviewed you for the course, you said that you had a conversation with one of your children about a school project and said, let's make a decision together on how much effort you're going to put into this. It may be that this is not the be all and end all project of your academic career, and that enough effort is enough, and you don't have to go the extra mile and get an A on everything, because that will allow us to have some family time that's also important to us. And so being able to make those decisions, I think, or to just be aware that you can make those decisions without necessarily jeopardizing your child's entire academic future, future.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
a really powerful thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and it really is just the idea that actually you're at the center of your world. Despite these things that you have to do, you are at the center of your world, and understanding that this particular week this is going on or that's going on, and actually not everything needs to be the same. And I think that really is a really important part. If it happens to have been you've had lots of late nights, because I mean in my world, for example, as a musician, I often am doing shows, I'm getting in very late. My understanding of knowing what I can achieve the next day is different than when I'm not doing a show and I'm going to bed at 10 o'clock. And from a child's point of view, that's the same. If you've just been doing an awful lot of difficult stuff, or maybe they've been doing a project which has meant they've had slightly later nights, then you need the time off to balance it up. Or whatever the takeaway is, or the give and take within these scenarios, is just to say, what is it that I truly need in, like you demonstrated there, how much effort do I need to put into this in order for it to support my life, rather than just having to do X because I'm told so. And that's right. Really, I guess it's really, supporting children to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and from there they make a really good conscious choice about how they want to show up at school. Yes. And also in what they're doing. And I think that's probably the best way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and show up for their lives as well. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's a great way of putting it.
In a lot of ways, I think we're really challenging the way that education is done, because we tend to think of it, this is just the way it's done. The government says this is how it's going to happen, and so that's how it's going to happen. And so I was reading Alison Gopnik's book recently, The Gardener and the Carpenter. She's a professor at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And she says, if we taught baseball the way we teach math, we would start by studying tiny elements of the game and the rules, and then we would have children reproduce classic plays. And then when you actually had graduated college and had a postgraduate degree, then you would actually start playing. And so in Japan, by contrast, students learn at the beginning of elementary school that math isn't just these tiny little building blocks, but you can use it to solve problems, which is sort of a revolutionary concept in how math is taught in the quote Western world, because we don't teach students how to solve problems until much later. In Japan, the students are coming up with hypotheses on how to solve a problem, and then the teacher leads a whole class discussion to compare the approaches and solutions, whereas we tell children, this is how you calculate 2 plus 2, this is how you multiply. And Japan outscores the US by 60 points and the UK by 40 points on the international standardized PISA tests. So
I mean, it is amazing, isn't it? The episode 66, where I was chatting to Dr. Tony Yu the other day, it was called Rehumanizing Primary Education, and it was all about, teachers understanding the story of children. It was all about the fact that actually putting the arts and the more creative things back in, and actually children that may be deemed to be struggling in maybe maths and English, as that's the focus at the moment, giving them more to do doesn't actually help. Actually having a broader idea of things actually is really important. Having the community being involved in everything that's going on, and actually just having, he talked about it in a really nice way of sort of like a ramble through life, experiencing lots of different things, rather than it being a race to the end, or a race to the SATs or the exams and all of that kind of thing. I thought that was
really so critical.
Absolutely. I thought that was a really sort of nice sort of way of putting it. But the one thing that struck me was the idea that he said he's really glad that actually children learn to talk before they get to school, because if we tried to teach children how to talk in the way we teach them everything else, then no one would ever learn anything.
Yeah. And you did mention earlier that school is a great place to learn reading and things like that. And yes, it can be for the average child, and especially for the child who's slightly ahead of the curve and picks things up easily. But for the child who's behind and isn't developmentally ready to start reading when school tells them they need to be ready to start reading, that creates some real problems, because information is going to start to be presented through reading because it's convenient for the school and convenient for the teacher, not because it's convenient for the child. So yeah, that can create a real problem. But what I loved about what you said about the guy that you just interviewed, it reminded me of a concept in the Reggio Emilia approach to early childhood education, which is based in a town in Italy, and they call it the 100 languages of children. And it's the idea that children have, and it's not a literal 100 items, but it's an infinite number of ways that children can express their knowledge and their learning. And we focus on just one or two in schools, and that by adding back the arts and the music and all those kinds of things, you're giving them other languages to use when maybe they're not so skilled at the math and the reading, and they still need a way to express themselves.
I think that's brilliant, and it really is that kind of understanding of that we're all different, and that there's a great picture, and I can't remember who it's by, but it comes up every year on my social media feeds of we're gonna oh, let me think about this. It's basically a picture of like an elephant, a snake, a monkey. There's a whole selection of animals, and we're going to make sure that this test is absolutely fair, and I want you to climb this tree. And it's absolutely brilliant, and I must mention, because every time I talk about it, I think I must find out exactly who it's by and what it's from. But you get the idea, and it's that kind of, yes. If you're the elephant, you think you failed already, and it's that kind of,
and you haven't even started yet. You just look at the tree and you know you've failed.
Absolutely, and it's such a key thing, and it just really makes me smile, because I just think, yeah, that's exactly it. Find what you're interested in, find what you're good at, find what's going to work for you, and like you say, then your passion will go, and you'll see the flow of where you want to go. And that's certainly been my experience as I've learned as an adult as well, all the things that I've needed to do. So let's take it back to your podcast itself, and how does that format kind of work? What is it that does that work through the courses that you've done, or does it take other explanations for other themes and other ideas?
Yeah, the podcast mostly focuses on issues related to child development. Things like, is self-esteem really worth having? And it turns out, no, it's not. That's a whole podcast episode on that. I'm working on one on gratitude right now and how that develops. And so those kinds of topics. And so ultimately what I hope to do is to bring all this together, because I think there's a real focus on child development early in a child's life. And then we kind of switch to thinking about learning once they get to school age. Mm-hmm. And I really see them as much more intertwined throughout the child's life. The child is always learning, the child is always developing. And so what I ultimately hope to do is to bring all these threads together. But in the meantime, I have a library of 60 plus episodes on child development available right now for free that anyone can go and listen to. And you can find that at yourparentingmojo.com. And if you are interested in homeschooling, well, basically, if your child is not yet of school age, or if you're in the lower elementary grades, is what the course is geared towards. And it's basically designed to help you think through, could I really do this? From all facets of how to make that decision. And so you can find information on that. Everything I do is accessible at yourparentingmojo.com. If you're specifically interested in the courses, you can do a /courses at the end. And then if you click through to the homeschooling course, there's actually a free 7-question quiz that you can take to assess your initial readiness. And that returns personalized results to you via email based on your specific situation and your location and that kind of thing. And if your child is not yet of school age, or is in the elementary grades again, and you see, basically, if you see some kind of potential for trouble, if you see your child is the kind who doesn't like to sit still, or they're especially sensitive, or you just can't understand how the school system is going to work with your child, then that course is for you. And so if you're on the lower end of that age range, there's actually a free infographic on 11 things you can do to support your child in learning math without standing in front of them with flashcards. They're more appropriate for the younger ages, but people who have children through approximately elementary school age would potentially find that course useful. So
fantastic. And that really just sums it up, really. There's the podcast, like I say, with 60 odd episodes now, which is just, I love listening to it, because it's just that kind of, I just wish I had the brain capacity to understand all that research, and also to be able to broadcast it and share it in the way that you do, which is riveting. I find it so interesting, the way that it
wow. I'm not sure anyone's ever described it to me in that word before. People say they love it and they find it interesting. Nobody has ever said it's riveting.
No, it's the way you bring it across with all that understanding. I think that's really great, and as you said, the 2 courses as well, which is so important for people. I think, especially at that particular age of where are we going to go from here, how are we going to make these decisions, and so yourparentingmojo.com is the place to go, and and I hope you get the most out of all the free resources through the podcast, and make the most of the courses if you feel that's the way you need to go. So, Jen, thanks so much for joining me. It's been really lovely chatting to you again, and I wish you well with the rest of the podcast. And also, I can't wait for, I would imagine it must be some kind of large volume book that you'll come out with all the work that you've been doing when you tie all these things together.
Yeah, there's no book in the cards yet, but we'll see. I wouldn't want to predict that far ahead. Thank you, Mark. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks very much. Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.